Our case study number 2 will be our Guggenheim case study, and it's going to be a joint presentation of 4 people who all worked on this piece. Many more actually worked on this piece. So, Brian Castriota here is our Samuel H. Kress Fellow in Time-Based Media Conservation. He received an MA in Art History and a certificate in conservation from the Institute of Fine Arts NYU in 2014. He completed advanced internships in the conservation departments of the National Museums Scotland and the Guggenheim, and has worked as a contract conservator for time-based media artworks at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. His research interests include the theoretical and practical implications of technological obsolescence and change, and perceptions of integrity and authenticity in modern and contemporary art. And then we have, we have Jiwon Shin, who, I should have done this beforehand, sorry, is a student at NYU Abu Dhabi, class of 2016. She's majoring in computer science and visual arts. She has participated in research on topics in the conservation of software-based art as a research intern at the Guggenheim. That's our collaboration that we're running with Dina Engel and her students. Her work comprised conducting code analysis, creating documentation, and researching conservation solutions for software-based art. And then we have Matthias, and both Matthias and Carolyn Slayson have already graduated from NYU. So I can't really call you students anymore, and I apologize if I have done so before. You both graduated in May with a degree, with a degree in, I'm gonna have to do this by person, so. With a joint, so Mia graduated with a joint degree in anthropology and linguistics and minors in French and web programming and applications, which is where she worked with Dina and then became part of our collaboration. An avid researcher of online interactivity and discourse, Matthias studied applications of computer science in art and the humanities under Dina Engel and the Courant Institute. Matthias participated in the spring 2015 research on the conservation and on the conservation and code analysis of Siebren Versteeg's Untitled film. Caroline Slayson created her own unique concentration, theater, and technology, and earned a minor in web programming and applications within the Department of Computer Science. As an undergraduate student of Dina Engel, Slayson participated in the collaborative case study research with the Guggenheim. So, welcome to our first Brian is going to start, and then we're going to hand it over to our joint case study presentation.
Good morning. So our presentation today will introduce you to a work from the Guggenheim collection, Untitled Film 2 by artist Siebren Versteeg, and we're very thrilled to have him here with us today. This is a case study that, as Joanna mentioned, was a collaboration over the last year with, between our conservation department and NYU's Department of Computer Science. There we go, okay. So this is the work set up in our conservation lab. So on first sight, it looks like a video installation, but it's in fact a software-based artwork driven by 2 shuttle computers. And the artist-provided medium line describes the work as, quote, 2 internet-connected computers output to LCD screens, real-time obituary listings, and real-time birth announcements. So the work was originally conceived in 2004 as a 2-channel projection. And here you see it installed at University Galleries of Illinois State University. And then 2 years later, for an exhibition at Bellwether Gallery in New York, the artist reconfigured the work for display on 2 LCD screens. And at this point, he retitled the projection Untitled Film 1, and titled the monitor version Untitled Film 2, which is the version that was accessioned into the Guggenheim's collection. So this is some video documentation that we created of the work in action in its native environment. So we see, just to walk you through what you're seeing, we see that the content of the two screens is reminiscent of the opening and closing credits of a film. On the left screen, we see first names, presumably of newborn babies, appearing in slow succession. And then on the right screen, we see a list of full names. These are presumably the names of recently deceased people. And they scroll continuously upwards over this black background like the end credits of a film. And in the background on the left screen, we see these various scenes of landscapes and nature. But you'll notice that the imagery appears somewhat jittery, recalling the aesthetics of handheld camera footage. But if you look closely, there were a few that showed water, for example. You'll notice that there's no actual movement within the scenes themselves. They're within the images themselves. They're, in fact, static images that are animated to move around the screen. If you watch long enough, you'll also see that the images do repeat, and also that they have varying durations, but there's no real discernible pattern or order. Additionally, the content on both screens is overlaid with artifacts that we know from analog 16 or 35 millimeter film projections, like these vertical scratch lines, dust spots, lint, and they all help underscore the work's reference to film. And then you can also hear this very somber minor key soundtrack that's playing. And like the images of the nature scenes, there's no real discernible pattern, just these sort of ambient droning chords. Let's see. So although the work initially assumes the appearance of a two-channel video installation, in reality, all of the audiovisual content is being live generated by two executable files, and they're each running on one of the two computers. So when the Guggenheim acquired this piece in 2006, it received from the artist these two Shuttle XPC computers. Both machines are signed on their underside by the artist and contain two Macromedia Director executable files, which are scripted to autoplay when the computers are booted. The museum also received two identical signed backup CD-ROMs containing copies of the executable files and a brief README about the work's display, as well as a CD-ROM of Windows XP Home Edition. So for display, the work requires two 1610 LCD monitors, as well as speakers for the 4 audio channels. And the equipment you see here is not part of the artwork per se, it's replaceable and somewhat variable. The work also requires both computers to be connected to the internet via their Ethernet ports. So if the work is not connected, everything else works. You see the images, the soundtrack, the film effects, they all display, but no text will appear. So when we pulled the artwork from storage and started the investigation in 2014, the work had not been shown since 2006. Switching on the artist-provided computers after 8 years of storage was a very scary moment, as Joanna indicated earlier. We had never seen this piece before. We had little idea of what the artwork was, how it's supposed to function and behave, and we didn't have any video documentation or similar evidence of the work in its native environment. Furthermore, we hadn't collected the source code in 2006. So all we had in the way of code was the compiled executable files on the computers and the CD-ROMs. So this is to say that at the time of acquisition in 2006, the field of conservation had very few best practices at its hands to support the collection of software-based art. But today, as Martina has demonstrated, acquisition processes have become much more informed and involved. So our preliminary investigation of the decompiled code, here with Professor Dina Engel and a colleague from our Guggenheim IT department, brought to light a very surprising finding. All these years, it had been our understanding that the artist-provided computers were scraping the names directly from the internet, as implied by the medium line. But when we were trying to find the URLs of the obituary and birth announcement websites in the code, we found only one URL, and that was to the artist's server. So you see highlighted here the URL to siebrenversteeg.com. So this means that the actual scraping of the web for the birth and death names is happening on the artist's server, not the computers in the Guggenheim's collection. So in other words, back in 2006, the Guggenheim only collected part of the artwork, part of the code that controls the work, and the functionality of the artwork therefore depends on the artist's ability to maintain his server, which is a preservation risk of its own. So we therefore selected this work as one of the case studies for our collaboration with Professor Dina Engel and her students. In advance of the project, we reached out to the artist, and he was very helpful and engaged. He provided us with a copy of the uncompiled source code, as well as the missing code from his server, and the permission to host this part of the work on a Guggenheim server in the future. However, we still had a number of questions that could only really be answered through in-depth code analysis. So employing this method, which Dina Engel and Glenn Wharton will elaborate on tomorrow, the goal was to understand the technical underpinnings of Untitled Film 2, to document its anatomy, its behaviors as they're defined in the code, as well as to understand any vulnerabilities related to software and hardware dependencies and interdependencies. So the following are some questions that we posed to the students to guide their investigations. Firstly, what programming language was the work created in? How are the program's functions dependent on this language? Could the work be ported to another language in theory without compromising these functions? What is the native resolution and color space and aspect ratio of the work? How many nature images are there? Is their sequencing random? How are their varying durations determined? Likewise, how is the soundtrack generated? Is there a single audio file? And how is that being programmed? We also wanted to know how the film artifacts are generated, how many there are and what shapes they have. We had questions about hardware dependencies as well. If you were to run the program on a different computer, for example, would the processing speed impact the audiovisual output, such as the duration and animation of the images or the display of the names? We also wondered how the images and sound files were packaged within the executables, and whether it might be possible to isolate those files and back them up. Lastly, we wanted to know what the specific internet websites are that the work is reaching out to for birth names and death names. So over the course of 2 semesters, the students pored over the artist's code to answer these and other questions. They visited the conservation lab here to observe the work in its installed state. They participated in an interview with the artist, and they completed conservation documentation templates that we tailored to accommodate software-based artworks. So 3 of the students are here with us today to share the amazing wealth of information that they unearthed.
So, as Brian explained, our role in this case study was to conduct code analysis on the artwork from the point of view of computer scientists with the aim of informing conservation. Untitled Film 2 was created using Macromedia Director 2004, a multimedia authoring tool that has since become somewhat obsolete and has been superseded by newer contemporary versions such as Adobe Flash, which, as we heard before, might be going in the same direction. But the first step in analyzing the behaviors of Untitled Film 2 was to procure a machine that could run Macromedia Director 2004. So at this point, that's a vintage machine, and we had to have something that ran Windows XP operating system so that we could install Macromedia Director 2004 and examine the executable files outside of the artist-provided computers. We then started looking at the artist-provided source code itself. The process began with grouping the code based on the overall role that it plays in the artwork. So here we have a general overview of what's happening in the artwork, and we can start by looking at the vertical boxes, vertical components, and it's really operating from 3 different locations. The first being the artist-provided computers, where the Lingo scripts are running. The second being the artist server, where the ASP files are running, And the third, the internet website where we're gathering information to display on the screens. So we can first go over a general overview of how the program is working itself. And I'll just point out what I'm talking about here. So first, when the program is started or when it runs out of cached names, a lingo script in the executable files is prompted to go and fetch names. So that's on the very left side of the screen. And the lingo script calls upon the configuration files, which is the next box over, and looks up. I can't find it. TechFocus, this one? Here, this button, here? Oh, okay, here we go. All right, so here, where was I? The lingo scripts then call upon the configuration files, all around here, and these configuration files look up the URL to the associated ASP file on the artist server. The ASP files contain scripts that then scrape the names from specific websites, and those are associated with the specific ones. So here we have the birth feed, they're coming from birth announcements, and down here we have the death feed, and they're coming from obituary listings. The lingo script then saves the names into a designated text file, and the program goes through the list of names and displays the names on the associated screens until the bank of names runs out and the process is started again. Now we're going to zoom in a little and look at the actual code so that you can have a better understanding of the visual components that are accompanying the general overview. First, I'll show an example of an ASP script, and then we will look at a lingo script. So this here is an example of an ASP script that lives on the artist server. ASP is an acronym that stands for Action Server Page. There are two ASP files that are associated with this artwork, the first being the birth feed and the second the death feed. ASP files are processed on a web server and return text information to the user based on their inputted requests. The following example is an excerpt from the death feed ASP file, which selects the names that are displayed on the screen. This specific function is called Parse Names, and it is essentially troubleshooting the irregular characters that will come from the website along with the name. So here you can see that this is removing less than signs, here we're removing parentheses, and here hyphens. So all of the extraneous characters that would display on the screen are removed in this function. And that way it can be displayed more regularly and just as the text, and it appears more film-like. All right, here we go. We combed through the code, paying special attention to the Okay, so we come through the code paying special attention to the comments made by the artist because those are vital to our conservation techniques. Basically, what we are looking for is the ways in which the artist commented the code. And here, these comments are actually showing their quadruple quotation marks. And with these comments, we can see that the artist will explain parts of what the intentions were, which sometimes at this point has changed when compared to the results, especially if the reference is to something that has changed over time, whether it be a website that no longer exists or something in the code that is no longer functioning as it was originally intended to. And we can also see, not in this example, parts of the code where the artist has commented out or no longer kind of showed part of his process. So we can see how the artistic process worked and what the problem-solving process looked like, and maybe sites or URLs that he may have tried and did not end up using as a part of the final product, and those can serve as clues as to what the original intention was. And in order to do this, we also made a completely different copy of this code and then went through and annotated the code ourselves in order to preserve a version for future coders that explained our findings. So moving on to the lingo scripts. As I mentioned before, there are a number of lingo scripts packaged into the Macromedia Director files on the computer. These lingo scripts control the final visual and auditory output. Here is an example of a lingo script, and lingo, as we heard before, is a program-specific language that was developed by John Henry Thompson for Macromedia Director specifically. It is described as a verbose, object-oriented scripting language because of the way that it, in some ways, emulates a spoken sentence syntax structure. So if we look at, for example, lines 11 and 12 set the location of sprite 1 to the location of sprite 1 and so on. But it emulates a spoken syntax structure more than, for example, the example of C that we saw earlier. So this code itself controls the location and jittery movements of the background images that we saw before. And Jiwon is now going to go into more detail about the lingo scripts.
Now let's look at exactly how the lingo script selects and animates the nature images on the screen. Packaged into the executable file, there's a library of 77 nature images. We learned in an interview with the artist that he sourced these images in 2004 via Google image search and downloaded them to include in this artwork. The lingo script will continuously generate a random number between 0 and 299, and whenever the randomly generated number is 1, the script will randomly choose any of the 77 background images. Because it is up to randomness, the duration of how long each image is shown varies. The image jitter that imitates the look of a handheld camera is precisely scripted as well. The lingo scripts define that an image can move up to 1 pixels to the left and right and 4 pixels to the top and bottom. Within these set boundaries, the direction of the movement and the extent of the movement are randomized. To enhance the impression of a handheld camera look, the artist carefully designed a slight blur to accompany the jitter movement. He did so by having each image consist of 3 layers with different transparency levels. The bottom layer, which is 100% full opacity blend image, stays put. Only the image layer with the 50% blend is animated to move around. The topmost layer, the 20% blend, is a plain gray rectangle of the size of the screen, and its only purpose is to gray out the colors a little bit. The 4-channel audio soundtrack of Untitled Film 2 is also generated by lingo scripts. Packaged into both of the executable files are 4 WMA audio files, 2 of which are samples of string instruments and the other 2 of the brass instruments. All 4 files are only a few seconds long. The lingo scripts highlighted in the red box on the screen call the audio files and randomly manipulate the rate at which they are being played at. Played to alter the pitch within a minor scale. The extent to which the rate of the original WMA files are shifted, again, depends on random chance, as you see here on the code. The film artifacts are also created by using a Macromedia Director lingo scripts. The vertical lines pointed out here and the arrows on the screen, and the dust specks and hairs shown in the red circles are scripted to appear on the screen randomly and with animated movements. The artist created 3 categories of film artifacts, which are all bitmap images that are packaged into the executable file. The first is so-called a cigarette burn, and in the film projection world, it indicated when to change the reels. The artist programmed the cigarette burn to appear on the top right corner of the screen whenever the program has run out of names and calls the web to gather more names. The second group of the artifacts are the specks that imitate dust. And the third group of marks is hairs and smudges. These appear less frequently on the screen than specks.
So, after we concluded the code analysis and we established all of these scripted behaviors of the artwork, the Guggenheim conservators asked us for an assessment on the dependencies and preservation risks of the artwork, as well as recommendations to support future conservators and IT staff who may want to maintain the piece in the long term. There it is. All right. So, to support support future preservation of the artwork, we extracted 3 groups of multimedia assets from the executions. So first, we have that library of 77 bitmap images. Next, those 8 so-called behavioral cast members that Jiwon just showed you. And finally, 4 sound files. So these multimedia assets are essentially the building blocks of the artwork, in that if this artwork were ever to be migrated to a different programming language, these multimedia assets would still be needed to recreate the piece. So now at this point, the Guggenheim Conservation Department has all of these in their archives. And next in our risk assessment, we identified then the 3 main areas of concern. So first, the software, which Mia discussed, Macromedia Director, is outdated, over a decade old, and while it's similar to Flash, it's just obsolete. Likewise, any files made in a newer version of Director would not work in the version that the artist used, which just presents issues in writing updates. And furthermore, Director is proprietary, so that's going to put limitations on support for the software in general. Our second main area of concern is the dependence of the external server in the artist studio, which Brian also discussed. And as Mia showed you already in this, this diagram, you can kind of just see how it's the artist and not the museum that's in control of the maintenance of that server. So while working with the artist is obviously very important, handing off so much responsibility can yield to uncontrollable change. But finally, our most pressing vulnerability had to do with the link rot of the primary content source for this artwork. So as explained, this artwork was coded to scrape names from very specific websites, supplying names of newborns and recently deceased. And that rendered the work completely live. However, that webpage that initially was providing those live feed of birth names no longer exists. In fact, this is what you now get when you type the URL into your browser. So clearly not supplying any sort of content to be used. And given the external dependency and this issue, the artist made changes to the ASP files in order to keep the artwork pointed at functional URLs. And this then introduces the need for version control between artists and museums. So luckily, the artist did provide comments in the code when these changes were made. So here I just have a snippet of the part of the code that's controlling the birth feed. In this little red box, you can see there's an active link. It's the yellow, the baby center link. That is now the current URL that's sourcing those birth names. And you can see right above it in gray, that's the inactive link that doesn't work anymore. So while it's nice that we have these comments and lucky for the museum, a concerted effort to document these versions of the code would obviously be very beneficial. So, as in the case of Untitled Film 2, there is currently no immediately available alternative live feed of birth names on the internet that could just be swapped out in the code simply. So at the moment, the ASP files on the artist server actually points to a website that's not providing a live feed of birth names, but rather a fixed list of popular names in 2014, which is the year that the code update was made. So this is what the website looks like now. You can see it's just completely fixed. It's an extremely long list. There's a lot of content to pull from. But yeah, quite different from the original source. And that's why now you can see what they still looked like in 2006 as opposed to 2015. In 2006, you can see the name, it's a first name and then a last initial, whereas in 2015 you just get that first name because the content feed is just having popular names as opposed to names of real individuals. So for an artwork like Untitled Film 2, the inherent reliance on an internet webpage is an extremely significant vulnerability. There is no long-term solution for the problem at hand, and while the current solution does technically work, and that Untitled Film 2 does display names of babies, it also raises questions about the meaning and conceptual integrity of the work, which, as its medium line suggests, is composed of real-time birth announcements. So in terms of documenting these and all of our other findings that we've sort of showed you, we used a conservation report template for software-based artworks, which was provided by the Guggenheim. We synthesized all of our research into 8 sections, including identification, description, components, interactions between components, code analysis, history of modification, condition assessment, and finally risk assessment. So within the report, we consolidated absolutely everything that we could, and in doing so, we provided kind of a narrative about the functionality of the piece as well as the history of the piece, and that all led up to that risk assessment and our recommendations for its long-term care. So in conclusion, our code analysis brought to light technical underpinnings of the work's key functions and behaviors as perceived by the viewer. So this investigation then, one, clarified the work's anatomy, the relationship between its constituent parts. Two, it identified the work's technical dependencies and vulnerabilities. And finally, the investigation provided insight into the artist's working space. Moving forward, the information gleaned from this research will allow collection caretakers to begin strategizing on how best to manage works' near and long-term preservation.